Please, save my mom first. Gideon's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he pulled his truck to the side of the deserted Texas highway. Every instinct screamed at him to keep driving. A single father with calloused hands and a past full of questions had no business getting involved in someone else's tragedy. But that voice, desperate, selfless, impossibly brave. It was the voice of a child who understood sacrifice in a way that broke his heart. The silver sedan lay crumpled on its side like a discarded toy, steam rising from the engine in thin, ominous ribbons. Through the spider-webbed windshield, he could see them. A blonde-haired girl, maybe 8 years old, clutching her unconscious mother with a strength that defied her small frame. Blood trickled down the woman's forehead, staining her soft mauve blouse, while the little girl's cream-colored shirt was torn and dirty from the impact. Gideon killed the engine and stepped out into the suffocating heat. His mustard-yellow work jacket stuck to his back as he approached the wreck. Every step weighted with the memory of another accident, another woman, another time when he'd arrived too late. But not today. Not this time. "I've got you," he called out, his voice steady despite the chaos. The little girl looked up at him with eyes full of terror and something else. Hope. Even as her world crumbled around her, even as she faced the unthinkable, she was thinking of someone else first. That was the moment Gideon knew his quiet life was over. This wasn't just about pulling two strangers from a wreck. This was about the kind of man he chose to be when no one was watching, when there were no rewards, when helping meant risking everything. What he didn't know was that the crash wasn't random. What he couldn't see was the expensive sedan that had been following them for miles before forcing them off the road. And what he never could have imagined was that by saving these strangers, he was stepping into a war between family, fortune, and the kind of evil that wore a respectable face. But as he reached through the shattered glass to check for a pulse, as he pressed his shirt against the woman's bleeding wound, as he promised a terrified little girl that everything would be okay, none of that mattered. All that mattered was keeping his word and proving that some people still stop when others drive away. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The hospital waiting room at 3 a.m. was a purgatory of fluorescent lights and plastic chairs. Gideon sat in the corner, still wearing his work jacket, now stained with someone else's blood. His hands were raw from pulling apart twisted metal, his face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. He'd been here for 6 hours, and no one could tell him anything concrete. The doctors had taken Opal, that was the woman's name, he'd learned, into surgery to relieve pressure on her brain. The little girl, Hattie, had a broken arm and severe shock, but she would live. What worried everyone was the silence. She hadn't spoken since they'd pulled her from the car, hadn't even cried. She just stared with those haunting blue eyes, as if she'd seen something too terrible for words. A nurse approached, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Mister?" "Just Gideon." "Gideon, I need to ask, are you family to the patients?" "No, ma'am. I'm the one who found them." She glanced at her clipboard, then back at him. "We've been trying to contact next of kin." The woman had no identification, no phone, nothing. The car was registered to an address in Florida, but when we called, the number was disconnected. "We're running out of options here." Gideon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. What happens if you can't find anyone? The state will have to step in. The little girl will go into protective custody while we sort things out. And if her mother doesn't recover her memory? The nurse's voice trailed off, leaving the implications hanging in the sterile air. Images flashed through Gideon's mind. Hattie in some cold institutional bed, surrounded by strangers. A woman with no past, no identity, warehoused in a state facility. It was wrong in every way that mattered. "How long before you make that call?" he asked. "Probably by morning. Policy says we have to." What if someone stepped forward? Someone willing to take responsibility? The nurse looked at him more carefully now, taking in his worn clothes, his working man hands, the obvious fact that he lived paycheck to paycheck. "You mean you? I mean hypothetically." Hypothetically, they'd need somewhere safe to stay, someone with a clean background check, and the resources to care for them. The state doesn't just hand over children to strangers, no matter how well-meaning. Gideon nodded slowly. He understood what she wasn't saying. Men like him didn't get to be heroes in stories like this. Heroes had money, status, the kind of life that looked good on paper. Heroes didn't live alone in rented houses, driving trucks that needed new brakes. But as he sat there in that waiting room, listening to the tick of a wall clock that seemed to count down Hattie's remaining hours of safety, Gideon made a decision that would change everything. Sometimes being a hero wasn't about having the right qualifications. Sometimes it was about being the only one who refused to walk away. The ghost had been following Gideon for 3 years, ever since the phone call that shattered his world into before and after. Your wife has been in an accident. 7 words that turned a Tuesday evening into the last normal moment of his life. Sarah had been driving home from her book club, the same route she'd taken every week for 5 years, when a drunk driver ran a red light and T-boned her sedan at 40 miles per hour. She'd lived for 6 hours in the ICU, machines breathing for her while Gideon held her hand and made promises he couldn't keep. I won't let you go. I won't give up. We'll get through this. But Sarah had already made her choice, slipping away while he dozed in the chair beside her bed, leaving him to wake up to silence and the terrible understanding that some things couldn't be fixed, no matter how desperately you wanted to fix them. Their daughter Emma had been 12 then, old enough to understand that mommy wasn't coming home but too young to process the finality of it. She'd started acting out at school, picking fights with classmates, failing tests she could have passed in her sleep. The guidance counselor suggested therapy, but therapy cost money they didn't have, and Emma had inherited her father's stubborn streak. She refused to talk about her feelings, refused to cry, refused to admit that her world had ended that Tuesday night. 6 months later, she was gone too. Not dead, Gideon couldn't have survived that, but taken by Sarah's sister Linda, who lived in a pristine suburb outside Seattle and had always thought Gideon wasn't good enough for her sister. Emma needs stability, Linda had said, standing in their living room with a briefcase full of legal documents. She needs consistency, proper home. What she meant was that Emma needed a mother, and Gideon was just a mechanic who worked with his hands and couldn't provide the kind of life a growing girl deserved. The worst part was that Emma had wanted to go. Not because she didn't love him, but because staying meant confronting the empty chair at the dinner table, the bedroom that still smelled like Sarah's perfume, the crushing weight of shared grief that neither of them knew how to carry. In Seattle, she could pretend her old life had never existed. She could start over, become someone who had never lost everything. That was 3 years ago. Emma called every few weeks, stilted conversations full of long pauses and careful questions about school, friends, the weather. She never asked when she could visit. He never asked when she might come home. They both knew the answer, and neither of them was ready to say it out loud. Now, sitting in the hospital waiting room at 4 in the morning, Gideon understood why the ghost had led him to this moment. Sarah had died alone on a highway while strangers drove past her wreckage. Emma had chosen a new family rather than rebuild the old one. But here was a little girl who'd nearly lost everything, and a woman who might wake up to a world where she remembered nothing. Here was his chance to be the person who stopped instead of the one who drove away. When Opal finally opened her eyes 18 hours later, the first thing she saw was Gideon's face hovering over her hospital bed. She blinked slowly, her pupils dilated from the medication, her forehead wrapped in clean white bandages. A machine beeped steadily beside her, monitoring vital signs that had stabilized overnight. "Where?" she began, her voice barely a whisper. "You're in the hospital," Gideon said gently. "You were in a car accident. You're safe now." She tried to sit up, winced, and fell back against the pillow. I can't remember." Her hand went to her head, fingers probing the bandages. "What happened to me?" "Your car went off the road. You hit your head pretty hard. The doctors say you have a concussion." "My car?" She looked confused, as if the concept of owning a vehicle was foreign to her. "What kind of car?" Gideon felt a chill run down his spine. "A silver sedan." You were driving with your daughter. Daughter? The word came out flat, emotionless. I have a daughter. Before Gideon could answer, a doctor appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. Dr. Martinez was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the sort of competent manner that came from 20 years of delivering difficult news. She approached the bed slowly, studying Opal's face. How are you feeling, Mrs.? The doctor waited, but Opal just stared at her blankly. She doesn't remember, Gideon said. Anything, Dr. Martinez nodded as if this confirmed her suspicions. Memory loss isn't uncommon with head trauma. Sometimes it's temporary. Sometimes, she let the sentence hang. What's your name, honey? Opal's forehead creased with concentration. I don't know. I should know, shouldn't I? Why don't I know my own name? It's Opal, Gideon said. Your name is Opal. Opal. She repeated it slowly, testing how it felt in her mouth. That doesn't sound familiar. Are you my husband? The question hit him like a punch to the chest. No, I'm the one who found you, who called for help. Oh, she looked away, suddenly embarrassed. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be rude. I just don't remember anything. Not my name. Not the accident. Not. Her voice broke. Not having a daughter. Dr. Martinez made notes on her chart. We've been trying to locate your family, but we haven't had much success. The car was registered to an address in Florida, but the contact information appears to be outdated. Do you remember anything about where you're from? Any family members we could call? Opal closed her eyes, concentrating so hard that lines appeared around her mouth. After a long moment, she shook her head. Nothing. It's like I didn't exist before I woke up here. What about the little girl? Gideon asked. Hattie. She was in the car with you. Hattie. Opal repeated the name the same way she'd said her own, like a foreign word she was trying to learn. Is she all right? She's down the hall. Broken arm, some bruises, but she'll recover physically. The thing is, Gideon hesitated, unsure how to explain. She hasn't spoken since the accident. The doctors think it's shock. Can I see her? Dr. Martinez nodded. I'll have a nurse bring her down. But I should warn you, she may not remember you either. Trauma affects children differently than adults. 20 minutes later, a pediatric nurse led Hattie into the room. The little girl moved slowly, her right arm in a bright blue cast, her blonde hair combed but still showing traces of the accident. A small cut on her cheek, a bruise on her temple. She was wearing hospital pajamas that were too big for her, making her look even smaller and more fragile than she was. When she saw Opal, she stopped in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Hattie's face crumpled, and she ran to the bed, climbing up carefully to wrap her good arm around Opal's neck. Opal's breath caught. Oh, sweetheart. Oh, baby. The words came naturally, instinctively, even though she claimed not to remember having a daughter. She held Hattie close, stroking her hair, making soft shushing sounds. It's okay. Mommy's okay. We're both okay. Hattie pulled back and looked into Opal's eyes. Her mouth opened as if she wanted to speak, but no words came. She touched Opal's bandaged forehead gently, then looked at Gideon with an expression that was both grateful and heartbreakingly sad. She knows you, Gideon said to Opal. Even if you don't remember her, she knows you. Opal nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. I may not remember being her mother, but I feel it. Does that make sense? I look at her and I know I would do anything to protect her. That's a start, Dr. Martinez said quietly. Sometimes the heart remembers what the mind forgets. But there was still the problem of what came next. Without identification, without family, without even a social security number they could verify, Opal and Hattie were essentially ghosts themselves. The hospital's social worker had been making calls all morning, but every lead had hit a dead end. The address on the car registration belonged to a house that had been sold 6 months ago. The previous owners had moved out of state and left no forwarding information. There were no missing persons reports that matched their descriptions, no worried relatives calling hospitals along their route. It's like they don't exist, the social worker told Gideon privately. I've never seen anything like it. No digital footprint, no paper trail, nothing. Either someone went to great lengths to erase their identity, or what? Or they were running from something, or someone. That afternoon, while Opal dozed and Hattie sat in a chair beside her bed coloring in a book the nurses had brought, Gideon made a decision that would change all their lives. He approached the social worker's temporary office in the hospital's administrative wing and knocked on the door. I want to take them home with me, he said without preamble. The social worker, a tired-looking woman named Patricia Hernandez, looked up from a stack of paperwork. Mr. Stewart, we've been through this. The state has procedures. The state has procedures for dumping a traumatized little girl into foster care while her mother recovers in some institutional facility. That's not a procedure. That's abandonment. You're not a relative. You have no legal standing. I have the standing of being the only person who seems to give a damn what happens to them. Gideon sat down across from her desk. Look, I know how this sounds. I know what people will think. A single man wanting to take in a woman and child he doesn't know. But I also know what it's like to lose everything. And I know what it's like to have no one who cares enough to catch you when you fall. Patricia studied him for a long moment. You understand that there would be background checks, home visits, supervised monitoring? This isn't something we take lightly. I understand. And you understand that if we discover any indication that your motives are anything other than altruistic, we will remove them immediately and you will face criminal charges? I understand. Why? She asked finally. Why are you willing to turn your life upside down for strangers? Gideon thought about Sarah, dying alone on a highway. He thought about Emma, choosing a new family rather than healing the broken one. He thought about the 3 years he'd spent living like a ghost himself, going through the motions of existence without really living. Because someone should, he said. And because maybe they're not really strangers. Maybe they're just family I haven't met yet. 2 days later, Gideon signed more paperwork than he'd ever seen in his life and drove Opal and Hattie to his small rental house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much to look at. A 2-bedroom cottage that had been built in the 1950s and hadn't been updated much since. The paint was peeling, the floors creaked, and the kitchen faucet dripped no matter how many times he tried to fix it. But it was clean, it was safe, and for the first time in 3 years it wouldn't be empty. He'd spent the previous evening preparing Emma's old room, washing sheets that had been sitting in the closet since she left, dusting furniture that had served no purpose except to remind him of what he'd lost. Now it would serve a new purpose. Giving a little girl a place to heal, a place to feel safe, a place to remember how to speak. Opal moved carefully through the house, her hand trailing along walls and furniture, as if she were trying to absorb information through touch. The doctors had cleared her to leave the hospital, but she still suffered from dizzy spells and headaches, and her memory showed no signs of returning. She paused in the doorway of the bedroom Gideon had prepared for her, his own room, which he'd given up in favor of sleeping on the living room couch. You don't have to do this, she said for the dozenth time since leaving the hospital. We're not your responsibility. No, Gideon agreed. But you're not anyone else's responsibility either, and that's not acceptable. Hattie had been silent during the drive, staring out the window at the unfamiliar landscape. But when she saw her new room, painted pale yellow with white curtains and a bed covered in a quilt that had belonged to Emma, something shifted in her expression. She walked around the room slowly, touching everything. The dresser, the bookshelf, the small desk by the window. When she found a music box on the nightstand, one that played a simple melody when opened, she sat on the bed and listened to it with the sort of intense concentration usually reserved for prayer. That was my daughter's, Gideon said softly. Her grandmother gave it to her when she was about your age. Hattie looked up at him, her eyes full of questions she couldn't voice. Where was his daughter now? Why wasn't she here? What had happened to make this room available for a stranger? She lives in Seattle now, Gideon said, answering the unspoken questions. With her aunt. After her mother died, she needed something I couldn't give her. But she would want you to use her room. She would want you to be safe. For the first time since the accident, Hattie smiled. It was small and tentative, but it was real. She hugged the music box to her chest and nodded, and Gideon felt something in his chest that he'd thought was permanently broken start to flutter back to life. That night, as Opal helped Hattie get ready for bed, Gideon stood in his workshop behind the house and tried to process what he'd done. The space was his sanctuary, filled with tools that had belonged to his father and grandfather, projects in various stages of completion, the comfortable chaos of a man who worked with his hands. He'd always done his best thinking here, surrounded by things that made sense, things that could be fixed if you knew how they worked. But people weren't like engines or transmissions. People had hidden damage, invisible breaks that no amount of mechanical skill could repair. And now he was responsible for two people whose damage ran deeper than he could measure. He looked up to see Hattie standing in the doorway, wearing pajamas that were still too big for her cast bright against the faded fabric. "Hey, sweetheart, shouldn't you be in bed?" She stepped into the workshop, her eyes wide as she took in the organized chaos around her. She walked slowly past his workbench, past the half-restored motorcycle in the corner, past the pegboard full of tools, until she stopped in front of an old mantel clock that had been sitting broken on a shelf for months. She pointed at it, then looked at Gideon questioningly. "That old thing? It belonged to my dad. Hasn't worked in years. I keep meaning to fix it, but..." He shrugged. "Some things seem too broken to bother with." Hattie picked up the clock carefully, turning it over in her hands. She examined the mechanism in the back, then looked at Gideon again, her expression clearly asking for permission. "You want to try to fix it?" he asked. She nodded eagerly. Gideon pulled up a second stool to his workbench. "All right then, let's see what we can do." For the next hour, they worked together in comfortable silence. Hattie watched intently as Gideon disassembled the clock's mechanism, explaining each piece and its function even though she couldn't respond. She handed him tools with surprising accuracy, as if she understood what he needed before he asked for it. When they found the problem, a broken spring that had stopped the gears from turning, she clapped her hands together in delight. "Now comes the tricky part," Gideon said, pulling a replacement spring from his parts drawer. "This needs to be wound just right. Too tight and it'll snap. Too loose and it won't work. It's all about finding the right tension." Hattie watched as he installed the new spring, her brow furrowed in concentration. When he was finished, he held the clock up to his ear and smiled at the steady tick-tick-tick of its restored heartbeat. "Want to do the honors?" He handed her the key that wound the clock's mechanism. Hattie turned it carefully, counting the rotations the way she'd seen him do, until the spring was properly tensioned. Then they both held their breath as Gideon set the time and placed the clock on the workbench. It ran perfectly, its hands moving in steady, measured increments, marking the passage of time in a world where yesterday had been erased and tomorrow was uncertain. Hattie looked up at Gideon with tears in her eyes. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, she wrapped her good arm around his waist and hugged him tight, and Gideon understood that some forms of communication didn't require words. The next morning brought the first real test of their new arrangement. Sheriff Roy Patterson had known Gideon since high school, back when they'd both been more interested in cars than consequences. They'd taken different paths, Roy into law enforcement, Gideon into the trades, but they'd maintained a mutual respect over the years. That respect was evident in Roy's voice when he called to say he was coming by to talk. "Nothing official, you understand?" Roy said, standing on Gideon's front porch in his brown uniform, hat in hand. "But there's been some talk around town. People are concerned." "About what?" "About you taking in strangers. About what your real motives might be. About whether that little girl is safe." Gideon felt anger flare in his chest, hot and sharp. Safe from what? From having a bed to sleep in? From having someone who gives a damn whether she eats breakfast? Safe from a single man who nobody really knows that well anymore, Roy said quietly. "Come on, Gideon. You've been living like a hermit for 3 years. People remember what happened to Sarah and Emma, and they remember how you shut down afterward. Now suddenly you're playing house with a woman who doesn't remember her own name and a kid who won't talk. That raises questions. What kind of questions? The kind that could get child services involved whether I want them to be or not. The kind that could get you arrested if someone decides to make a formal complaint. Through the window, Gideon could see Opal helping Hattie eat breakfast, cutting her food into small pieces because the cast made it difficult to use a knife. They looked like what they were. A mother and daughter trying to rebuild their lives after trauma. But he also knew how it would look to people who wanted to see something sinister. A vulnerable woman with no memory, a silent child, and a man with no family of his own taking advantage of the situation. What do you want me to do, Roy? Send them back to the state? Let them disappear into a system that doesn't care whether they live or die. I want you to be careful. I want you to document everything. Keep receipts for every dollar you spend on them. Keep a log of every doctor's appointment, every interaction with social services. Make sure there's always a witness when you're alone with the kid. And for God's sake, get yourself a lawyer. A lawyer? I'm not a criminal. No, but you're a man trying to do something good in a world that assumes the worst about men who try to do good things. That makes you vulnerable in ways you don't even understand yet. Roy's words proved prophetic sooner than either of them expected. Within a week, the whispers that had started in coffee shops and grocery stores had reached the ears of people with power to act on their suspicions. Social services began making unannounced visits, checking on Hattie's welfare with the sort of intense scrutiny usually reserved for confirmed abuse cases. Child psychologists interviewed her through play therapy, looking for signs of trauma beyond what the accident had caused. The investigators found nothing because there was nothing to find. Hattie was healthy, well-fed, and clearly attached to both Opal and Gideon. Her silence was consistent with selective mutism, a common response to severe trauma, and she showed no signs of abuse or neglect. But the investigation continued because the perception of impropriety was almost as damaging as impropriety itself. Gideon endured the scrutiny because he had no choice. Every morning, he watched Opal struggle to remember how to make coffee, how to braid Hattie's hair, how to be a mother to a child she couldn't remember giving birth to. Every evening, he watched Hattie work on puzzles and drawings, her face lighting up when she accomplished something small, her eyes always watching the adults around her for signs that they might disappear too. These people weren't burdens to be tolerated or problems to be solved. They were his family now, in all the ways that mattered, and he would endure whatever scrutiny was necessary to keep them safe. But late at night, lying on his couch and listening to the old house settle around them, Gideon couldn't shake the feeling that the real threat wasn't coming from well-meaning neighbors or overzealous social workers. The real threat was still out there somewhere, and it was looking for the woman and child who had somehow erased themselves so completely that they might as well have never existed at all. The black sedan with tinted windows pulled into Gideon's gravel driveway on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after he'd brought Opal and Hattie home. The car was immaculate, expensive, the kind that whispered money and power to anyone who knew how to read such things. Gideon watched from his kitchen window as a man in a charcoal suit emerged from the driver's seat, adjusting his tie and surveying the modest house with the sort of calculated assessment that made Gideon's skin crawl. The man was tall, maybe 45, with silver threading through his dark hair and the kind of tan that came from golf courses rather than honest work. Everything about him screamed wealth and authority, from his Italian leather shoes to the gold watch that caught the morning sunlight. He walked to the front door with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. When the doorbell rang, Opal was in the living room helping Hattie with a coloring book, their heads bent together over a picture of butterflies. Hattie had been making progress, still silent but more animated, more present. She'd even started helping with simple household tasks, setting the table for meals and folding washcloths with the serious concentration of someone desperate to be useful. Gideon opened the door to find the stranger holding an expensive leather briefcase, his smile perfectly practiced and completely cold. "Mr. Stewart? My name is Vincent Morrison. I believe you have my sister and niece staying with you." The words hit Gideon like ice water. Behind him, he heard Opal's sharp intake of breath, followed by the soft thud of a crayon hitting the floor. He turned to see her standing frozen in the living room doorway, her face pale as death. "Vincent!" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Oh God! Vincent!" "Hello, Opal." Morrison stepped past Gideon without invitation, his eyes fixed on his sister with an expression that might have been concern if it hadn't been so calculating. "We've been looking everywhere for you. When you disappeared with Hattie, we thought the worst had happened." Hattie had moved to stand behind Opal, her small hands gripping her mother's shirt. Something about Morrison's presence had triggered a response in the little girl. Not recognition exactly, but a primal fear that made her want to hide. I can't remember," Opal stammered, one hand going to her bandaged forehead. "The doctors said I have amnesia from the accident. I don't remember having a brother." Morrison's smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. "That's why I'm here, sweetheart, to help you remember, to take you home where you belong, where we can take proper care of you." "She is properly cared for," Gideon said, stepping protectively closer to Opal and Hattie. "And she's recovering just fine where she is." Morrison's gaze shifted to Gideon, and in that look was a lifetime of assumptions about men who worked with their hands, who lived in rented houses, who presumed to have opinions about their betters. "And you are the man who pulled them from a burning car when no one else would stop. How noble!" Morrison's tone suggested anything but nobility. "I'm sure my sister is grateful for your intervention, but this has gone on long enough. Opal needs professional medical care, not the amateur ministrations of a stranger. And Hattie needs to be with family." "I am family," Opal said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been since waking up in the hospital. "I mean, she's my daughter. That makes her my family. And Gideon." She looked at him with something that might have been love or might have been desperation. "Gideon saved us." Morrison pulled a manila folder from his briefcase, spreading legal documents across Gideon's coffee table with the casual efficiency of someone who'd done this before. "I have Opal's medical records here, dating back 20 years. Psychiatric evaluations, hospitalizations for severe depression, documentation of her inability to care for herself, let alone a child. Before her memory loss, she'd signed temporary custody of Hattie over to me while she sought treatment." The documents looked official, complete with letterheads and signatures and the sort of bureaucratic weight that crushed people like Gideon every day. But something about them felt wrong, too perfect, too convenient. "I don't remember signing anything," Opal said, studying the papers with growing alarm. "Of course you don't. You don't remember anything. That's precisely the problem." Morrison began gathering the documents. "I've spoken with the local authorities. They're as concerned as I am about this arrangement. A traumatized woman with no memory, a mute child, and a man taking advantage of their vulnerability. It's a situation that demands immediate correction." "No one's taking advantage of anyone," Gideon said through clenched teeth. "Aren't you?" Morrison's voice was silk over steel. "You're unemployed, living on disability payments from an old back injury. You've been isolated for years, ever since your own family fell apart. Suddenly you have a beautiful woman and a little girl under your roof, dependent on you for everything. How convenient for a lonely man." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, seeping into every corner of the room. Gideon felt his face flush with anger and humiliation, but before he could respond, Hattie stepped forward. She walked to Morrison with that peculiar fearlessness that children sometimes displayed in the face of adult monsters, looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her 8-year-old face, and shook her head slowly from side to side. Morrison's mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. "Hattie, sweetheart, Uncle Vincent has come to take you and Mommy home. Isn't that wonderful?" Hattie backed away from him, bumping into Gideon's legs, her breathing quick and shallow. Whatever memories she'd lost in the trauma of the accident, her body remembered something about Vincent Morrison that terrified her. 2 days later, Gideon was working in his garage when Opal wandered in, looking lost and fragile in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the open bay door. She'd been having more frequent headaches since Morrison's visit, as if the stress of trying to remember was causing actual physical pain. "I keep thinking I should know him," she said, settling onto an old wooden stool near Gideon's workbench. "Vincent. He has photographs of us together as children, legal documents with my signature. But when I look at him, all I feel is," she shuddered, "fear." Gideon wiped his hands on a rag, studying her face. "Maybe your subconscious is trying to tell you something your conscious mind can't access. Or maybe I really am crazy like he says. Maybe I'm just a broken woman who can't tell the difference between help and harm." "You're not broken," Gideon said firmly. "And you're not crazy. You're healing. That's different." Opal smiled at that, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since Morrison's visit. She stood and wandered around the garage, examining his tools and equipment with the careful attention of someone trying to ground herself in concrete details. When she reached the shelf where he kept his motor oil and lubricants, she stopped suddenly. "Gideon." Her voice was strange, distant. "What brand is this?" He looked over to see her holding a quart of Valvoline motor oil, her hands trembling slightly. "Valvoline. I've used it for years." "Why?" Opal stared at the distinctive blue and white label as if it were a snake about to strike. There was a smell in the car right before the crash. Something chemical, acrid. And this label. Her eyes widened in horror. "Oh God. Oh God. I remember." She dropped the oil container, and it hit the concrete floor with a metallic clang that echoed through the garage. Opal stumbled backward, her face paper white, one hand pressed to her mouth. "What is it? What do you remember?" "The car behind us. It had been following us for miles, staying just close enough to make me nervous. The driver kept flashing his lights, trying to get me to pull over, but something told me not to stop. Then he got closer, started bumping our rear bumper. Hattie was screaming, and I was trying to drive and call for help at the same time. The memories were flooding back now. 3 weeks of amnesia cracking open like a dam. He pulled up beside us on that curve. I could see his face through the passenger window. It was Vincent, my own brother, trying to run us off the road. And when our car started to flip, when I knew we were going to crash, I could smell motor oil leaking from our engine. That exact smell." Gideon felt something cold and terrible settle in his stomach. "Why would your brother want to hurt you?" Opal sank back onto the stool, her entire body shaking. "The trust. Our parents left everything in a family trust when they died. Vincent controls it while I'm competent. But if something happened to me, if I were declared mentally unfit or if I died, he would inherit everything. Millions of dollars, Gideon. Enough to kill for. And Hattie? She was in the car. She saw everything. That's why she can't speak. She watched her uncle try to murder us both. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The mysterious lack of identification, the absence of any paper trail, the way Morrison had appeared at exactly the right moment with exactly the right documents. He'd been systematically erasing Opal's existence, preparing to have her declared dead while he searched for her body and any witnesses to eliminate. "We have to go to the police," Gideon said. "With what proof? My recovered memory against his legal documents? A mute child who can't testify? He's had months to prepare for this moment, Gideon. We're not dealing with some common criminal. This is a man with resources, connections, and the patience to plan a perfect crime." That evening, as if summoned by their conversation, Morrison returned with reinforcements. This time he brought lawyers, 3 of them in identical dark suits, and a sheriff's deputy who looked deeply uncomfortable with whatever he'd been asked to do. "Mr. Stewart," the deputy said, holding up an official-looking document. "I'm sorry to inform you that you're being served with a restraining order. You're required to stay at least 500 feet away from Opal Morrison and her daughter, effective immediately." Gideon stared at the papers in disbelief. "On what grounds?" One of the lawyers stepped forward, a thin man with calculating eyes. "On the grounds that you've been systematically isolating a vulnerable woman with severe mental health issues, preventing her from receiving proper medical care, and potentially placing her minor child in danger." That's insane. I saved them. You've been taking advantage of them, Morrison said smoothly. Opal's psychiatrist has reviewed her case and determined that her current living situation is detrimental to her recovery. She needs to be in a controlled environment where her medications can be properly managed and her progress monitored by qualified professionals. What psychiatrist? What medications? Morrison produced another folder, this one thick with medical records and psychiatric evaluations that painted a picture of Opal as dangerously unstable, prone to delusional episodes and violent outbursts. The woman described in those documents bore no resemblance to the gentle, thoughtful person Gideon had come to know, but they carried the official weight of medical authority. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, Mr. Morrison has obtained a court order granting him temporary custody of his niece while his sister receives treatment. The child will be placed in his care immediately. Hattie had been hiding behind Opal during this entire exchange. But when she heard those words, she did something unexpected. She walked directly to the deputy, looked up at him with those two old eyes, and opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She tried again, her small face screwing up with effort and frustration. Still nothing. See, Morrison said with false sympathy. The trauma of living here, of being exposed to an unstable environment, has only worsened her condition. She needs professional help, not amateur psychology from someone with no training. But Hattie wasn't giving up. She went to Gideon's desk in the corner of the living room, found a piece of paper and a pencil, and began to draw with fierce concentration. Her cast made it difficult, but she managed to sketch recognizable shapes. A car, another car behind it, stick figures inside both vehicles. Then she drew something that made everyone in the room go silent. She drew the second car ramming into the first one, over and over, until the paper was covered with impact marks and the pencil had torn through in several places. She held up the drawing and pointed at Morrison. Children's drawings aren't evidence, one of the lawyers said dismissively. They're fantasies, expressions of trauma, not reliable testimony. But the deputy was looking at Hattie with new interest. He knelt down to her level, speaking gently. Sweetheart, did someone hurt you and your mama? Hattie nodded vigorously, then pointed at Morrison again. She's confused, Morrison said quickly. The accident was traumatic. She's conflating her uncle's arrival with the crash itself. It's a common psychological phenomenon in cases of severe PTSD. Hattie threw down the pencil and ran to Opal, wrapping her arms around her mother's waist and holding on as if her life depended on it. And maybe it did. The deputy stood slowly, his hand moving unconsciously to rest on his service weapon. Mr. Morrison, I think we need to slow this down a bit. Maybe bring in some child psychologists. Get some expert opinions before we make any hasty decisions. The court order is quite clear, Deputy. The child needs to come with us now. The court order was issued based on information that may not be complete. I'm not comfortable removing a child from what appears to be a stable environment without more investigation. Morrison's mask was slipping again, his controlled facade cracking under pressure. Deputy, I trust you understand the consequences of interfering with a legal court order? The penalties for obstructing justice. It was a threat, pure and simple, and everyone in the room recognized it. But before the deputy could respond, Hattie did something that changed everything. She found her voice. He heard us, she whispered, so quietly that everyone had to strain to hear. Uncle Vincent heard us. The room erupted in voices. Morrison denying, lawyers objecting, Opal crying. But Hattie kept talking, her voice growing stronger with each word. He was chasing us in his car. Mama was scared and crying and trying to call for help, but he kept hitting our car with his car until we flipped over. I saw his face through the window right before we crashed. It was Uncle Vincent, and he was smiling. She's confused, Morrison said desperately. The trauma has confused her memories. She's combining different events. No. Hattie's voice was clear now, strong and sure. I'm not confused. You tried to kill us because you wanted Mama's money. I heard you talking on the phone to someone about how much easier everything would be if we just disappeared. You thought the crash would kill us both, but Gideon saved us. He pulled us out of the fire and took care of us when no one else would. The deputy was calling for backup now, his radio crackling with urgent requests for additional units. The lawyers were backing toward the door, suddenly eager to distance themselves from their client. And Morrison himself was looking around the room like a trapped animal, calculating his odds of escape. "You can't prove anything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's the word of a traumatized child against documented evidence of mental illness and financial irresponsibility." "Actually," the deputy said, snapping handcuffs on Morrison's wrists, "we can prove quite a lot. Amazing what turns up when you run someone's financials in connection with an attempted murder investigation. Seems you've been liquidating trust assets for months, transferring money to offshore accounts. Hard to do legally when the trust beneficiary is still alive." As Morrison was led away in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence and threatening lawsuits, Hattie collapsed onto the couch between Opal and Gideon, emotionally exhausted from her breakthrough. She'd found her voice at exactly the moment when it mattered most, when silence would have meant losing everything that had become precious to her. 3 months later, the town that had once whispered suspicious things about Gideon's motives gathered in the high school gymnasium for a different kind of conversation. The local newspaper had picked up the story, then regional outlets, then national news. Local hero saves family, uncovers murder plot, had become the kind of feel-good story that people shared on social media and discussed around dinner tables. But more than fame, the story had brought community. People who had been content to judge from a distance suddenly wanted to help, to be part of something good and redemptive. A fund had been established to help Gideon open his own auto repair shop, something he dreamed about for years but never had the capital to attempt. The benefit dinner was packed, with families Gideon barely knew bringing casseroles and desserts, local businesses donating gift certificates and equipment, teenagers from the high school setting up tables and decorating with handmade banners that read, "Heroes live here," and "Thank you, Gideon." Opal, her memory fully restored now that the stress of threat had passed, worked the crowd with the natural grace of someone accustomed to social events. She'd remembered her old life gradually, the wealthy upbringing, the unhappy marriage, the messy divorce that had left her with custody of Hattie, and a hefty trust fund that her brother had been systematically looting for years. But she'd also chosen this new life, chosen to stay in the small town with the man who'd saved her, chosen to build something honest and real instead of returning to the gilded cage of inherited wealth. Hattie, no longer silent, had become the unofficial hostess of the event, introducing herself to every new arrival with the boundless confidence of a child who'd been through the worst and survived. She wore a dress that Opal had bought specially for the occasion, bright yellow with white flowers, and her cast had been decorated by classmates with drawings of butterflies and hearts and encouraging messages. When the crowd had settled and the last of the dinner plates had been cleared away, Sheriff Patterson took the microphone. "I've known Gideon Stewart since we were kids getting into trouble together," he began, drawing chuckles from people who remembered those days. "And I've seen him through some of the hardest times a man can face. But what I witnessed 3 months ago wasn't just a rescue. It was the kind of courage that defines a community, the kind of character that makes us all want to be better people." He gestured to where Gideon sat with Opal and Hattie, embarrassed by the attention but unable to escape it. "Some folks like to talk about family values, about what it means to take care of each other. Gideon didn't talk about it. He just did it. When two strangers needed help, when the easy thing would have been to drive away and let someone else handle the problem, he stopped. He risked his reputation, his safety, and his peace of mind to do what was right." The sheriff's voice grew serious. "And when this town let suspicion overcome compassion, when we allowed fear to cloud our judgment about his motives, Gideon didn't get bitter. He didn't give up. He just kept doing what was right, day after day, until the truth came out." The applause started slowly, scattered claps that built into a sustained ovation. People stood, whistling and cheering, celebrating not just Gideon's heroism but their own capacity for growth, their ability to recognize good when they finally saw it clearly. Later that evening, as the gymnasium emptied and the cleanup crews finished their work, Gideon found himself alone with his family on the school's front steps, looking out over the small town that had become home in ways he'd never expected. "So what now?" Opal asked, leaning against his shoulder. "You've got enough money to start your shop. Hattie's enrolled in school here. I'm thinking about taking some college courses, maybe becoming a teacher." She paused, studying his profile in the dim light. "Unless you want us to move on, find our own place." "No," Gideon said quickly. "I mean, if that's what you want, of course. But I was hoping—" He struggled to find words for feelings that were too big and too new to fit into casual conversation. "I was hoping we could stay together. All of us. Not as charity cases or temporary guests, but as family. Real family." Hattie, who'd been half asleep against his other side, perked up at this. "Like you could marry Mama and be my real daddy?" Both adults laughed at her directness, but there was nothing funny about the hope in her voice, the desperate need for permanence that she'd learned to hide but never outgrow. "We'll see about that," Opal said, but she was smiling when she said it. One step at a time. Gideon looked out over the town where he'd lived most of his life, where he'd lost everything and found it again in the most unexpected way. The old ghosts that had haunted him for 3 years. Sarah's death, Emma's absence, his own failures as a husband and father, were still there, but they no longer defined him. He'd learned that grief didn't have to be a permanent resident, that healing could happen even when you thought it was too late, that family could be chosen as well as born. "One step at a time sounds perfect," he agreed, pulling both of them closer. "We've got all the time in the world." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human plans and dreams, but somehow blessing this small moment of happiness, this modest victory of love over fear, of courage over convenience. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, carrying freight and passengers to destinations unknown. But for the first time in years, Gideon had no desire to be anywhere other than exactly where he was. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going.